Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.
Welcome to the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly. I'm Aurora Bella-Austriaco, President of the Chicago Bar Association, and during this segment, we will discuss human trafficking. What is it? Is it on the rise? What can we do to stop it? I am honored to have Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez as my guest. Anita Alvarez is passionate about fighting human trafficking and created a human trafficking initiative shortly after taking office. She also authored the Illinois Safe Children Act, an effective new law used to prosecute the exploitation of children. Welcome, Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez.
Oh, thanks, Aurora.
I know you've got a very busy schedule, and having you here is really a pleasure.
Oh, it's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. Now, what is human trafficking? People have this idea of what it is, but I don't think they really understand what human trafficking is.
You know, human trafficking really is modern-day slavery because it's forced labor, and it could manifest itself, you know, in a workplace, maybe, you know, in the labor force, such as in a restaurant, you know, in a factory, or we see it also in the sex trade. So it really is a forced labor. Many times, what we've seen is what's been called either debt labor or bonding labor, and that is really people who are forced in a work situation, maybe because they owe someone money, maybe they came to this country illegally, and someone's holding that over their head, and so they're being forced into a situation and forced to work. And be subjected to not just physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional abuse, and maybe with immigrants we've seen their papers being withheld and that sort of thing.
Right. Now, Anita, how big of a problem is that here in Chicago?
You know, it is a problem in Chicago. It's a big problem because, you know, Chicago is a transportation hub. Right. It's a visitor attraction. We've got, you know, a major international airport and convention center. So for trafficking to exist, particularly the sex trafficking, Chicago is a ripe place for this type of crime. And so we've seen it particularly too in immigrant communities, you know, with the labor trafficking as well. So yeah, it's going on like right in our backyards.
Right, right. And that's, I think, what's so scary about it, because we have a lot of, it's a melting pot in Chicago. Are most of the victims immigrants coming here? Are a lot of them also, you know, kids in our own backyard?
Well, we've seen it both ways. When it comes to the labor trafficking, particularly the immigrant groups are very vulnerable, obviously. Sometimes, as I said, people do enter the country illegally, and someone could take advantage of that, take advantage of them, and so force people into maybe a domestic servitude situation. Sometimes people come here, and albeit legally, again, not knowing the language, not knowing the system and our customs in the country, they again are vulnerable for people to prey on them. And when it comes to sex trafficking, I think what we have seen, particularly here in Chicago, is that it does happen to our kids, our own kids, not someone brought over from another country and being forced into this crime. We see it happening to our own kids, kids born and raised right here, that are being forced into a life of prostitution. And so you see it, you know, manifest itself in several ways.
Right. Now, what is the difference between smuggling and human trafficking? Is there such a big difference? Are they distinct, or are they pretty much the same?
Well, they're not the same, really. Smuggling really occurs many times. The person voluntarily allows themselves to be smuggled into the country. You know, we've seen just particularly at the border where people are smuggled over. These people are willing to come here in that fashion, and so that's smuggling. Trafficking is different, although sometimes smuggling can lead to trafficking. But trafficking really is a forced labor situation where the person does not want to be in that position. The person isn't voluntarily, working at a sweatshop with, no pay and voluntarily giving up their, passport and that sort of thing. So there is a difference, although smuggling can definitely lead to trafficking situations.
Right. Is it from, all the cases that you've prosecuted on human trafficking, is there a certain profile? And I know immigrants are, victimized quite a bit because of the language and cultural barrier. But outside of that, is there like a particular profile that, you could identify as, yeah, this looks like she's a victim of human trafficking?
I think that there's no one profile, but there are certain signs, particularly when it comes to the sex trafficking of minors. Their kids are usually from broken homes or kids who are out on the street homeless. Again, a vulnerable set of kids. When it comes to the labor trafficking, again, as you mentioned, the immigrant community is ripe for this type of abuse because of all the factors that we've already talked about. So there's no one perfect profile, but it certainly is something that crosses all socioeconomic, lines, because we've seen kids who pretty much have grown up in maybe what would be considered a middle-class home, but for some reason, develop a drug habit or whatever, and then find themselves homeless out on the street. So, and then get forced into the trafficking, sex trafficking. So it kind of covers everyone.
Right. And I really do applaud you for what you've done in terms of, helping the victims. Right after you took office, you actually were responsible for passing the Illinois Safe Children Act. Why don't you tell us about that act, what it does, and how effective it has been?
Right. We're very happy with the Illinois Safe Children's Act and very proud of the fact that we were able to get it passed with one try, which is sometimes very difficult. But when I took over and started to look at how we as prosecutors would handle these types of cases, and when I say these types of cases, I'm focusing more on the sex trafficking of minors. And when you looked at traditionally how we handle these cases, it wasn't, we didn't do a very good job at all, because what would happen traditionally is, say a 12, 13-year-old young girl is picked up off the street and charged with juvenile prostitution. And then what would happen? She would go over to the juvenile detention center for maybe a day or two, and then 2 days later she's back out on the street. And then if her pimp had been arrested, what happened to him? Nothing. Nothing was happening to him. And we were basically not giving her any of the services that she needed, and nothing was happening to the bad guy. And so we said, we have to do a different, we have to create a different approach on these types of cases. What can we do better? Number one was to look at how we traditionally worked up these types of cases. And number one, to recognize that the victims, they're victims, that, a young girl, 12, 13 years old, out on the street being picked up for prostitution is not out there doing that on her own. As a mother, it really comes close to home, right? No one could tell me that any young child's out there doing that on their own. Somebody's out there making money off of this child. Someone is out there forcing this child into this life. So we decided to look at the statute and basically rewrite it and create the Illinois Safe Children's Act. The first thing that act does is it decriminalizes juvenile prostitution. It takes those words, juvenile prostitution, right out of the statute. And so because the thought was, treat them as victims, because that's what they are, and not as defendants and not as criminals. And when you treat them as victims, part of the process was to get social service agencies involved with us, embedded in our office, to make sure that the first thing we do is recognize that they're victims, and then get them connected to the social service provider that they need, because these kids need long-term social services, not a day or two off the street. That's not going to help them. And then look at how can we build cases against the offenders that are certainly going to be more effective, and start actually convicting these guys who are out there, you know, making a business of this. So the law gives us that new tools as prosecutors. It decriminalizes juvenile prostitution. We treat them as victims, and it gives us, as state prosecutors, the ability to go up on a wiretap on cases of trafficking. And when you think about it, Aurora, in the past, we had the ability to go up on wiretaps for people selling drugs, but not for people selling children, and that's kind of backwards. So this new law gives us those tools. And it also increases fines for the Johns, gives us new forfeiture provisions so for impounding of automobiles and that sort of thing. So it really is a great law, because we've been able to, with our task force using this law, right now we have charged 56 defendants with trafficking, and we're seeing convictions and jail time, which is great, because the thought was, if we work these cases up, kind of like the way we do a financial crime case, and we get more evidence against the offender, we don't have to rely simply on the testimony of that young woman or that young man, because as tradition shows, they don't want to testify for a variety of reasons. So if we're able to go up on a wiretap and develop evidence, we don't have to just rely on their testimony. So it really is a much more effective way to work these cases up and to prosecute these cases.
Right. Now, you mentioned about forfeiture or impounding of cars as part of, you know, the penalty, in addition to penalties. Can you also go after them for, you know, kind of like a RICO, where you go after their homes, any assets that they have obtained because of doing this business?
Well, not under the new law, no. But we're happy that these increased fines and penalties, you know, again, they didn't exist before. So, and the money that is recovered goes into the social service providers. So we're basically able to get more funding for social services that the victims need.
Right, which is tremendous. It's tremendous help, because this, a girl or a boy who's been a victim, right? I mean, do they end up going back to their homes after they go through, you know, the social service agency, or do they go straight and part of the social agency would be providing a home? You know,
and I think that's social service agencies. We work with the Stop It program, which is part of Salvation Army, and IOFA, which is the International Organization for Adolescents. And I think especially Stop It, it's a 24-hour hotline and operation that they're able to help provide these young people a place to go. I think what we've seen, though, unfortunately, is the lack of resources out there, you know, beds and that sort of thing for these young people. So they have an alternative place to go. So we don't see them back out on the street because they have no place to go. So, and I know with the economy, many of our social service providers are being cut, but there really is a need, particularly for homes and for beds for these victims.
Right. You know, you kind of wonder also, it's an abusive, you know, for a kid to get into this relationship. Number one, have any of them talked about how they got into those situations? And two, it's an abusive environment, and why do they stay?
Right. And that, I guess, is the biggest question. And you know, why do they stay? And that question is asked many times in domestic violence cases, right? Why does the victim stay? Why doesn't she just leave? And I always say, well, that's easier said than done. You know, particularly with a young child. You know, maybe a 12, 13-year-old girl who's homeless, who doesn't have a family to go back to. Where does she go? Many times, what we've seen in some of our investigations and cases that we've tried is that many times these young girls are just pretty much picked up out on the street. Someone strikes up a conversation with them, shows them some affection, shows them some, you know, takes them out to dinner or buys them something. And the young girl is going to equate that with some kind of a relationship, maybe some kind of a loving relationship. Maybe it's the only, you know, a sign of affection they've ever had. We had a young lady tell us back a couple years ago in juvenile court that she would not testify against her pimp because he gave her a Subway sandwich and whenever she wanted. And so it's kind of sad that she would equate this relationship, you know, and you know, to a deli sandwich. But you know, it's because they're vulnerable and because they've been abused in many ways that any sign of affection they think is something which is positive. So it's difficult to get them, you know, to testify, but it's also difficult to get them to leave just because they have no place else to go.
Right,
you know?
right. So let's say from a neighbor's standpoint, I don't know if, you know, a neighbor is experiencing or is a victim or not. What are the red flags so that if I'm looking around and I see someone that it's a little fishy, how can I say, okay, this is a problem and I think this needs to be reported?
I think the awareness really needs to be increased for everyone, because everybody always thinks of trafficking as just an international issue, right? It happens in other countries. It doesn't happen here, but it does happen here. And I think what you can look for, particularly when it comes to young girls, is if you see a young girl, you know, out on the street at night, maybe dressing very provocatively, and with an older man, and you know, you kind of see the signs there, to call the police, you know, and let them know there's something suspicious, or you see her keep going in and out of the same house, you know, and so I think that's something that you need to make the police department aware of. When it comes to the laboring aspect of it, you know, many times there are situations, domestic servitude situations, where the person is forced to work in a home, not being able to leave, not being able to ever, you know, go out, and so I think you need to call the Department of Labor if you suspect that, you know, and again, sometimes it happens. You can go to a restaurant and not even realize that perhaps one of those waiters or waitresses is being forced into that situation. So the best thing to do is call the Department of Labor or call the police and let them know of your suspicions.
Right. There are, you know, various laws that could be very useful. One is the Illinois Safe Children's Act that we talked about. But can you tell us about the Predator Accountability Act?
That act is put into place to allow victims to civilly sue, you know, an alleged trafficker, and there doesn't have to be a criminal case pending. But this is the law is in place. However, there have not been any lawsuits filed, and I think we can, again, you go back to some of the same situations that you see in domestic violence cases, where the victim is afraid to come forward. There might be immigration issues. There might just be the person was so abused that they're afraid. But I know the legal aid is working on a protocol and a policy to develop cases, which again, so the law allows a victim to sue for punitive damages.
Right. Well, it's interesting. It's almost like, is there a public guardian or, you know, some guardian that's actually appointed to represent that victim's interest in the law? I mean, I equate it to kind of like, you know, an elderly woman in a financial scam. You know, they can't go and prosecute, but, you know, you get a public guardian or a guardian appointed on their behalf to prosecute the case. Is that something that...
Well, I know that the legal aid is working on something, and hopefully we're going to see, you know, someone, you know, have the ability to file a suit. Right.
Now you mentioned in the beginning that you have had prosecuted about 56. How big of a ring? I mean, it's 56 pimps. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, there are 56 defendants so far have been charged. 26 have already been either pled guilty or found guilty, and so the other cases are pending. What we've seen is that 15 out of those 26 cases, the person got jail time, which is great, and then the others were probationable, depending on the different charges that we filed. But what we've seen, though, is the amazing part of here in Chicago is our gangs are getting into the trafficking business, so to speak. You know, traditionally, as you know, I think we're all aware that we do have a gang problem here in the city of Chicago, unfortunately, and usually drugs is their main source of income. Well, they've been branching out into other things, such as mortgage fraud. And the other thing, what we saw last summer, we had our big operation, Little Girl Lost.
Right.
And in that operation, what we saw was the gang structure and the fact that the gangs are now involved in human trafficking. And gangs who would traditionally be, fighting against each other are kind of business partners in this enterprise, so to speak, where they would sell girls between the two gangs.
Right.
They would share girls. They would sell girls. They've discovered that this is lucrative, and they've discovered, when you sell drugs, you sell it one time, right, and it's gone. But you can sell a girl 3, 4, 5 times repeated, unfortunately. And so they have discovered that this is lucrative and this is a moneymaker for them. So what we've seen in the domestic sex trafficking here is the action of the gangs and the involvement of the gangs here in the city of Chicago, which is quite depressing in many ways.
Right,
absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of scary because we have a gang problem here in Chicago, but sometimes you just don't even know who's involved in a gang, and so I would imagine that's when they lure the little girls or little boys, and they become good company for them, and they go after.
Absolutely.
So when you say lucrative business for the gang members, that is scary.
It is
because
scary.
it's easy money for them, no bloodshed.
Right, absolutely, and that's what the other thing we saw was that it tends to be the older gang members who are getting into the trafficking because they're not out on the street, selling dope, and so there's less. They think they're under the radar with this type of crime, and they think there's less chances of them getting shot or getting shot at. So they find this to be a little more of a cushion for them.
Right. You've actually been very in the forefront in terms of prosecuting human trafficking. Tell us, one case that you've prosecuted, and you've prosecuted a lot, but the biggest case that you've prosecuted, on human trafficking.
There was a case, Bonaparte is the defendant's last name, and he was basically, he was trafficking young women. The first woman he picked up was at the train station. The woman had come here from Wisconsin to meet a friend at 19 years old, and the friend never showed up. And so she was there at the train station for a couple of days, and in which he, struck up a conversation with her, offered to buy her dinner, and then, basically got her back into the neighborhood and put her in a hotel and forced her to trade her body for, sex for money. Another woman, he did the same thing too, and she was older, but she had mental disabilities. And so that particular investigation, he received 18 years after he was found guilty, which we were quite happy. There was abuse in there as well, and these women were hit. But I think that the Little Girl Lost operation showed us a lot because it showed not only that the gangs were getting involved in this, but also the abuses that some of these girls are really have to endure. I mean, there were girls who were branded with the pimp's name tattooed on their shoulders. There was a new term that we learned, and that was trunking. And trunking is basically throwing the young woman in the trunk of a car for hours and hours on end as a form of discipline because she didn't do what the pimp asked her to do or didn't make as much money as he wanted her to make. And so that was a term obviously none of us had ever heard before. But the abuses that we learned over several different operations really opens your eyes to what is occurring, right here, here in our city. Another young girl told us about how she was chastised and disciplined and beaten because she acted her age. She was only 15, and she would carry a stuffed animal with her and a Bible. And so it angered the pimp. He told her, that she was acting her age, and she was abused for that. So some really things that, open your eyes, and it's sad to see that it's happening.
Right, right,
You
right.
know?
And it's not just, I would imagine, it's not just a Chicago phenomenon. I would imagine that it's probably all over
It
the state
is.
of Illinois. We just see more concentration here
Right.
in Chicago.
Right, and we've also in our some newer investigations, we're seeing a lot of young girls who are coming down from neighboring states. They're either coming down from Wisconsin, or maybe up from Indiana. You know, the neighboring states.
Right, right. Does the internet play a big part in promoting human trafficking,
It
Anita?
does. It does, because even in some of the operations that we've handled, we've seen girls tell us that they've had to walk the track, which obviously is walking the streets,
Right.
but also half of their clients, so to speak, were all obtained through the internet. Through, you know, there's so many different websites out there
Right.
that allow for this, you know,
Right.
that they're able to set up these so-called dates. And so yeah, so it's either they're getting their business from the internet or walking the track.
Right. From a layperson's perspective and community watch, how can a community get more involved and help out in, you know, sending out information that this is going on and these are possible red flags, and if we suspect something, you know, I know you
Right.
said contact the police. What else could the community do to help out?
I think the community needs to be aware, number one, that it is happening and not something to shy away from if they suspect it.
Right.
To, you know, call the appropriate authorities, or maybe, you know, get together and make sure that there is a place for these kids to go to in the event that, you know, they're picked up for this type of crime, so to speak, or, you know, to make sure that there are beds available, you know, a shelter and that sort of thing. But I think, you know, making the police aware that this is happening, or you suspect that it's happening, is the first step.
Right, right. You know, it's kind of scary because you have teenage kids. I have teenage kids, and I always tell them, stranger danger, right? Right. So for our kids, you know, what else could we really tell them? You know,
Right.
stay away from strangers. Don't meet with someone through the internet. What else would you advise?
Absolutely. I always tell my daughters, you know, bad things can happen quickly,
Right.
because bad things can happen quickly.
Right.
To just be aware, number one, of your surroundings. And, you know, if there's an older, you know, man trying to befriend you, I think that's a red flag.
Right.
You know, don't give out your personal information. Don't give out your cell phone number. And again, you know, we have to be aware of what sites they're on the computer.
Right.
Unfortunately, you have to, as a parent, be aware of that,
Right.
because, you know, sometimes, you know, the child doesn't have to come from an abusive situation. Maybe the child is just, you know, a quiet, introvert kind of, you know, and things can happen because, again, you know, they'll prey on, you know, the most vulnerable. So I think just to be aware of their surroundings and be aware and inform someone if someone suggests something to them,
Right.
you know, and your teacher, your parent, whoever it might be.
Right, right, right. And I know we're running out of time, but I'm just going to ask you this. You are a superwoman. You're the Cook County State's Attorney. You're a mother. You, like me coming home, you probably drive your kids around. How do you do it?
Oh, there's never a perfect balance, and you know that, right? I always say the homework always gets done. Maybe 10 o'clock at night, but it gets done. There's no perfect balance, but I think you make it work. You know, I wear a lot of different hats, as do you. But I think being a mother is probably the most difficult.
Right. Right.
Sometimes running the office is easier than handling the kids.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Sometimes you think of work as vacation from home, correct? Right. Well, thank you so much, Anita Alvarez. Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez, thank you for joining me to discuss human trafficking. I'm Aurora Balastriaco. Thank you for watching the Chicago Bar Association's Justice and Law Weekly.
Closed captioning for Justice and Law Weekly is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices in support of quality public television for the Chicago area.